Jumping right back in.
Okay.
I wanted to talk about the 3 Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons.
Okay.
We'll start with Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic the Hedgehog ABC is how I will refer to it. How did you first become aware of the property?
It was a huge video hit. I mean, part of our job, and I credit most of this to Andy Hayward, who was the president of the company and the owner of the company. He had a real knack for having his ear to the ground and picking up the vibes of what the next really hot property was going to be. And this was across any and all media that kids were interested in. And certainly video games fell in that category. We had already had success adapting several of the Nintendo properties to animation. And so Sonic the Hedgehog was a huge video game. So we approached Sega, and I think based on our track record with Nintendo and our usual ability to impress and persuade rights holders that we would respect their property and do a good job, we were able to make a deal with Sega, who was the rights holder for Sonic. At the time, the most prized placement for an animated series was Saturday morning on one of the networks. You got the best license fees, and you also got the best ratings in that arena. So that was always your first port of call when you had a hot property, is you'd go to the network. And we did that with Sonic, and they gave us an on-the-air commitment immediately. And that's unusual. Normally a network will make a development deal with you, which basically gives them the right to buy the property at a later date and expect you to write a pilot script and do some development art, and they put off their decision. But this was, if a property is really hot, they'll give you an on-air commitment right on the spot. And that's what happened with Sonic. In fact, and that became the Saturday morning Sonic series. And in fact, Sonic was so popular that we thought it was popular enough to also support a syndicated series 5 days a week at the same time. So we went back to ABC and requested their permission to launch a syndicated series simultaneously. And they said, no way. They said, we want this exclusively for our network, and we feel it will hurt us. It won't be special to us if we're on 5 days a week in syndication, which could be on any local affiliate, in any market in the country. It wouldn't even necessarily be on an ABC affiliate. So that was kind of a blow to us because we felt we had a really hot property on our hands, and we thought about it. And good producers learn not to take no for an answer. And we came up with the idea of a completely separate Sonic series, separate in every way that we could possibly make it other than the fact that Sonic was the star of it. And the main separation was that the ABC wanted a very sort of a serious and somewhat dark story franchise for their series, where the villain was ominous and the jeopardy was real and the drama and stakes were high. And so we came up with the idea of doing a completely different tone for a second series, using what we would call in the industry squash and stretch animation, which means sort of like the old Bugs Bunny, Tex Avery kind of animation with comical exaggerations of physics and all sorts of wild, crazy stuff. And we made our characters sort of we made Robotnik more silly. We gave him a couple of very silly henchmen that were incompetent, and it was just a completely different show in every way possible. And we went back to ABC and said, give us a second chance to pitch this. How about if we do a completely different show? And how this will help you, ABC, is it will increase the awareness of Sonic all around in all aspects, and it'll be synergistic with your series without in any way detracting from it. Your series will still be exclusive to you because it's so different. And to our surprise and delight, they accepted that pitch. They said, okay, you can do it. So that was great. So we produced both series simultaneously. We used different writing teams, and I think we had different production teams as well. Obviously, there were some economies of scale and shared labor pools, but mostly it was certainly different creative personnel on each of the series. And they both came out at the same time. And I think, I may be wrong or it may have happened since, but I think at least at the time, I believe that was the only series ever to launch simultaneously in syndication and on Saturday morning. I know Ghostbusters, the real Ghostbusters, real Ghostbusters, had been on in both of those venues, but I don't think they launched simultaneously. I think it launched first on ABC, and then a season later, it started in syndication. So I think Sonic was the first one, to my knowledge, that had ever succeeded in accomplishing that. And we were happy.
Who was the voice of Sonic?
The voice was Jaleel White, who was famous for being the primetime Urkel in a huge primetime sitcom whose title I don't remember.
Family Matters. Family Matters,
thank you. And we had, like a year or two prior to Sonic, we pitched ABC on doing a primetime Urkel. I'm not primetime Urkel, a Saturday morning animated Urkel series. And I think that's how we first got to know Jaleel. And I think it was Andy's idea. It certainly wasn't mine to use him for the voice of Sonic. It was not my idea, and I think it was Andy's. But boy, he worked out great, and he became sort of a friend of the studio. We used him in lots of things over the years since then, and we all got to know him. And I have to say, he was just a wonderful, wonderful young man at the time. Young, just a pleasure to work with. Everybody liked him. Totally professional. I think he was managed by his mother, and we got to know her, and she was great too. So it was a wonderful relationship we had with Jaleel over the years, and I think he did a fantastic job on the voice for Sonic.
So there were two. You talked about Adventures being much more comical and Sonic the Hedgehog on ABC being much more serious. Who wrote the theme song to Sonic the Hedgehog, the ABC version?
Well, the ABC, that's an interesting question. We had a system where we had a pool of composers, sort of a typical group of composers that we'd use on various things, and they would all submit ideas for songs on spec, and we picked the one we liked. And in the case of the network had to approve it. And in the case of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Saturday morning show, we went through several songs, and the network wouldn't approve any of them. They didn't like them. And I'm a songwriter. I've always been a songwriter. That's been my primary passion. And I kind of had a sense, I thought I had a sense for what the network wanted. And so I did a demo of a song that I wrote for the network series, and I submitted it, and they said, yeah, this is it. This is pretty much what we want. And I said, great. What later happened is they had some composers. The network did have some composers that they'd used on other series. And I don't know if it was patronage and they wanted to give them the work, or they genuinely wanted their input, but they gave my song to them so they could make some changes, and they ended up taking credit for it, although it was certainly lyrically mostly my song and musically mostly my song too. But I don't know if I ended up with any credit on it or not. I was supposed to end up with shared credit, and I don't know if that actually happened. And I didn't make a fuss of it because you really can't with the network. The network really dictates so much in that era, and we were so fortunate to be allowed to do the two series that I didn't really want to make waves. And my job wasn't really to be a composer anyway. But in the later Sonic series, we did a third Sonic series called Sonic Underground, and that was a syndicated series only. There was no network involved. And in that case, I also submitted a song, and I did it anonymously under a nom de plume through our music department. So the people that were going to judge and pick the song, and we did the same thing we always do, which was solicit a bunch of demos from our various composers for title songs. And usually there would be 3 or 4 of us that would get together and decide pick the song we liked for a given series. And in the case of Sonic Underground, I found a way to abstain from the voting. I made an excuse so I couldn't be there for the meeting, or I somehow removed myself from the process. And they didn't know that one of the songs in their pile was my song, because I didn't want to have an unfair advantage or an unfair disadvantage for that matter. I just wanted my song to compete on its merits, because we would never know who wrote any of the songs. We would just listen to them and say, this is the one we want. So in the case of Sonic Underground, one of the choices was my song, and to my delight, that was the one they picked. My colleagues picked without knowing that I even had a song in the pile, let alone that it was mine. And so that was the song that was used on Sonic Underground, completely my song, for which I did get credit. And it's kind of a thrill for me, because long before I ended up in television animation, or television for that matter, I'd always wanted to be a songwriter. I had been a songwriter, and I'd always wanted to have a, shall we say, a well-known song. And finally, here it was through a cartoon. I mean, it got heard millions of times, and it's even on YouTube now with well over 1 million hits, just for the people wanting to hear the theme song again and relive the nostalgia. It was apparently pretty well liked. The song was by the Sonic fans, so that was quite a thrill for me.
You talked about the one executive who you didn't name who was difficult from Sega. Do you remember any of the instructions that Sega had for you when you were developing the first 2 Sonic cartoons?
It wasn't so much that we were given difficult instructions, although there was one incident that I'll share with you, but just in following up your question about the difficult executive, she was difficult not in the sense of giving unreasonable instructions, but difficult in the sense of disputing everything that we said or did and not approving anything and giving contradictory instructions, not necessarily unreasonable ones, but just not clear ones. And in my opinion, trying to do things to make herself look good with her bosses at our expense. I mean, it was just a bad approvals person, to be honest with you. It wasn't so much difficult instructions. It was unclear, late, contradictory, changing her mind, all the kinds of things that make it very, very difficult to do a good production, with that kind of approval process, chaotic. But one incident in particular in that era of Sonic, and again, I want to emphasize that the people that followed that one person were terrific. There was a woman named Cynthia, whose last name I don't remember, but she was so good we ended up hiring her at Deke to be our licensing person for a while. And then there was a person named Jane Thompson, who I did mention earlier, who is a dear friend of mine to this day. And she was our hands-on approvals person for a couple of years, and she was just really everything that was bad about the first regime was good about Jane, and she made it a pleasure and really helped us, I think, to produce better material. Anyway, the one incident that I thought was kind of interesting with Sonic is with humanoid figures in animation. Quite a very common pencil mileage saving trick is you don't give them 5 fingers, you give them 4 fingers. And you give them 3 fingers and a thumb, basically. You save a finger just so you don't have to draw as much, and nobody notices, nobody cares, especially on a hedgehog. So we did that, and you have to get all your model designs approved by Sega, and they approved them. And we went into production, and we're animating. And then we get word that Sega of Japan has seen this design, and we're already halfway through animation. I think this was on the ABC version in the first season. And apparently there's some tradition in Japan where the Yakuza, which is the sort of Japanese mafia, cuts off fingers in Japan. Apparently the idea of missing a finger has a large cultural significance in Japan, much more so than we would have or have been aware of. And Sega of Japan was insistent that this could not be allowed, that their character could not just have 3 fingers. And they'd approved the model months prior to this. We were already in production, and it became a huge dispute because it was going to challenge our schedule, it was going to challenge our ability to deliver, it was going to be expensive to fix, and it was really, really a mess. And we felt we didn't want to do it because they'd approved the model. And as I say, it turned into a big dispute. And in the end, as I always like to joke, in the end we gave Sega the finger. we had to go back and redo it and add the finger to the character at our expense, as I recall, and great risk of not delivering on time.
Now, the ABC series has the same continuity as the Archie Comics series had, and I've always wondered this. I don't know if you know the answer or not. Were you in development with Archie Comics at that point to develop a series, or did you...
Which series are you talking about?
The ABC Sonic series.
Yeah, but which Archie series are you talking about?
Their Sonic the Hedgehog comics that they published themselves. Yeah, that they published.
Book.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I think we were. I mean, we had a relationship with Archie Comics. We had a very good relationship because we'd done the new Archies with NBC. I think was prior. I'm pretty sure it was prior to the Sonic series. And I think we'd also done an Archie's live action movie, Archie goes back to Riverdale or something like that, a live action movie. So we definitely had good relations with them. And I seem to recall that we were in contact with them and may have supplied them some artists or may have looked over their stuff or may have supplied them information about the story. I certainly couldn't give you any specifics, but I feel fairly confident in saying that, yes, we did work with them in some manner or some respect to ensure such continuity, yes.
The ABC series ends on a cliffhanger. Was there a proposed solution to that cliffhanger?
No, I don't remember, but oftentimes series will end on cliffhangers because the series is completely written. Oftentimes it's written completely prior to the show even going on the air. Quite often that's the case. All the scripts are done before the first episode is aired. But it's certainly all the scripts are done before the season is over. And this is the key point, the scripts are all written and the shows are all produced before you know whether there's going to be a next season or not. So you never know until it's too late whether your season is over and that's the end of the series. And so fans often get upset when animation series end in cliffhangers, but it's because we don't know if we're going to be going forward or not. I'll tell you one other funny thing. Something I meant to tell you when we were talking about under the subject of difficult, ridiculous approval requirements from rights holders. This was at Filmation. We, at one point, were trying to develop Benji, an animated series based on the live-action dog, Benji. I don't even know if people will remember that character, but it was, I think he'd been in movies. It's kind of like Lassie for the current generation at the time. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. This was to me, the most ludicrous set of dictates from a rights holder ever. We were given by the rights holder of Benji, who I think was the guy that wrote the screenplays, if I'm not mistaken. And he gave us a list of do's and don'ts for how Benji could behave in animation. And amongst the list was things like, Benji will never, ever wag his tail. Benji will never smile. Benji is a serious actor. He should be treated as the Sir Laurence Olivier of dogs. And I went on. I mean, it was just preposterous, honestly. This is vis-a-vis nothing, but I meant to mention it when we were talking about, you asked me what kinds of things I think rights holders could demand, and I always remember that being the most preposterous. It was pretty hard to write. I wrote the pilot script for this development, which, by the way, did not get picked up. But I wrote the pilot script, and I got to tell you, it was a challenge to write this script and respect the 10 Commandments of Benji.
Likeable dog protagonist that can't smile at any point. I can't imagine.
To be fair, I might be exaggerating, but I think that was there. It was honestly, it was so ridiculous. I don't think I'm exaggerating. I really do think it was that he couldn't smile, and I know he couldn't wag his tail, and he could, they didn't want him cute. But, and I understand that. I mean, they could have said, try not to make him cute. Try to err more on the side of, brave superhero dog. Okay, I get that. But it was just taken to such an extreme, honestly. And, when I read the Sir Laurence Olivier of dogs, I'm not making that up because I wouldn't remember it otherwise. It was just, we all had a laugh over it at Filmation, that's for sure. We all had a big laugh.
A show that was very long running that you co-produced, Madeline, I should say. Yes,
Madeline. Well, it was based on there were originally, I think there were either 5 or 6 books by an author named Bellman, French children's books that were classic books of children's literature. And we first made a deal with HBO just to do a few. I don't remember if it was all 5 or not. It might have been, but to do a very limited series of this book, because it was considered a very high-end property, and that was sort of in keeping with the HBO mandate and their sort of positioning and branding at that point was high-end. So we did these, and we assigned a terrifically talented writer named Judy Rothman to be the story editor for Madeline, and she stayed with the series for the duration of its run, and she really helped give it a unique voice. They came out great, and when you do them for a cable outlet, you don't have the same kind of ratings demands as the network, so you could really, you could have a sort of, you didn't have to compete with all the Saturday morning razzle-dazzle and action and, to be honest, a lot of Saturday morning then was sort of more boy-oriented. And, Madeline made no pretense for going after anything but the youngest boys. Certainly, I think older boys probably would not have been interested in Madeline and probably never were. Anyway, we made these, and they came out terrific. And I think there was a hiatus before we pitched them to ABC. I think it was a couple years before we went and pitched them to ABC as a Saturday morning series. And this was after, I think, the Children's Television Act had come into play of 1990 in the interim. I believe that's the correct timing, where I think we did the HBO ones prior to the Children's Television Act, although that wouldn't have applied to HBO in any case because it was cable. Children's Television Act only applied to networks and stations that needed licenses because that's how it was enforced. Anyway, ABC, the Children's Television Act had come into play, and ABC now needed shows that they could label and defend as educational. And they thought Madeline might make a good property for that, and we agreed. And we got Don Roberts involved, our educational consultant, whom I'd mentioned earlier. And we structured all of our ABC Madeline scripts around some piece of social learning or curriculum, childhood development curriculum, which does not have to be reading, writing, math, or a hard subject. It can be socialization and interpersonal behavior and feelings and things like that. And I think we did 2 seasons for ABC, if I'm not mistaken. And the show came out terrific. It was really, I think, one of the most charming things we did. And we ultimately won an Emmy for it. I don't know how. I think we may have been nominated more than once. We were nominated altogether, I think, for something like 14 Emmys before we won one. So to be honest, it's hard to keep track of which shows were nominated and how many times they were nominated. So I don't know if Madeline was nominated more than once, but I could share kind of a fun story about the Emmy for Madeline, if that would be interesting to you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, we were nominated. We'd been nominated for Emmys 14 times and lost 14 times. And I used to go to all the ceremonies, hoping against hope that maybe we would be a winner this time. And ceremonies every other year were in New York and in LA. It was for the daytime Emmys. And so I would go to New York for all the ceremonies, and I would go to the ones in LA, and we'd never win. And when we were nominated for Madeline, I had already left my full-time gig at Deke, and I was working part-time for Deke living in the Seattle area. And I opted not to go to the Emmy Awards that year because I figured it just didn't make sense for me to do it, and I didn't think we were going to win because we never won. Although I think at that time we had won for Carmen, but still I didn't think we were likely to win, and I didn't go. And I actually remember that I was traveling somewhere else that day, and I flew back to Seattle, and I stopped to pick up some sushi at I think a very working class neighborhood of Seattle, suburb of Seattle, on my way home. And I was not dressed well. I'd been traveling all day. I was sort of grubby, and I stopped to pick up some to-go sushi. And I look up, and they've got a TV playing while I'm waiting to get my sushi. And I noticed that the TV is an awards show. There was no sound, just a picture. And I hate award shows. I never watch them. And so I wasn't really paying attention. I'm just waiting for my sushi. And I look up, and I see that shot that you see when somebody has just been announced a winner, and they've got a camera in the audience, and the person that's going to accept the award stands up and walks towards the camera. The camera moves backwards as the person is walking towards the stage. And I'm just sort of half paying attention to this, and suddenly I realize that the person that has just stood up, that's walking into the camera to accept an award, is none other than my friend and boss and fellow executive producer, Andy Hayward. And I had completely forgotten about the Emmys. I hadn't given it a second thought. I didn't even realize that it was on that day. I mean, I know it sounds very cavalier, but after 14 times of losing, you don't pay that much attention anymore. And so suddenly I realized I'm standing in the sushi place. I look up at the screen. I realize it all clicks into place, and I realize I've just won an Emmy. And I got really excited. I said, "Oh my God, I just won an Emmy. That's my show. I just won an Emmy. This is great. I'd like to thank the sushi chef. I'd like to thank And everybody looks at me dead silent like I'm a complete lunatic. I'm in a suburb of Seattle. I'm not dressed well. And I'm suddenly claiming that this stupid show on the screen is me winning an Emmy. And there was no sound. And in fact, Andy was kind enough to mention my name. If the sound had been on, my name would have been mentioned, and I could have shown shown my ID. But as it was, people just thought I was crazy, literally nuts. So I suddenly got very quiet. I took my sushi. I left, and I always joke, Andy got the Emmy, I got sushi. But I did ultimately get my Emmy trophy, and I have it, and it was really an honor to win it. And it's always an honor to be nominated too. When I spoke cavalierly about it, the cliche is absolutely true. It's a huge, huge honor to be nominated for an Emmy. And even if you're nominated 14 times and don't win, it's still an honor. But you kind of get tired of going to the show and losing.
Another show that I'm sure you've never been asked about, but it's one that I remember vividly. We'll talk more about the other Emmy for Carmen in a minute, but do you have any memory of Street Sharks?
Absolutely. I mean, not a great memory, but I sure remember producing it. Gee, that was another one where I submitted a song. I submitted a song for several of our series, anonymously always, and my song did not get picked for that one. The only thing I remember about it is, and it's a good time to mention this person, we had a staff writer that I hired when I first came to Deke in 1986. The first person I hired was a guy named Phil Harnage, and he stayed all the way till the end of Deke, and he was such a huge creative asset. His fingers touched almost everything we did, because when we would develop something, he would be the first guy help us come up with ideas and kind of write out the initial pitches. And then, sometimes the network would ask you to hire certain writers, and the writers would do their own development or whatever. But Phil was sort of our main guy for everything and had a huge, huge number of credits over the years at Deeks, and just was liked by everybody that ever met him. I mean, I think he's arguably the most well-liked person, such a kind-hearted soul, and such a great, great, creative, gifted writer. And I remember, I mean, not that this is unusual because he wrote so many things at Deke, but I remember he did Street Sharks. He was the writer, and I think it was either I think it was a very limited series. It was for Mattel. It was based on their toy. It was kind of a fun toy. So I do remember it. I don't remember much about it. It's probably also a good time for me to mention Mike Maliani, who started off, I think, as a storyboard artist very early on at Deke. He was there even before I got there. And over the years kind of rose into being a producer. And I think sometime in the early 90s, Andy promoted him development or something, where he became sort of, in the sort of the early 90s, he became my counterpart. I was in charge of the writing, and he became in charge of the creative aspects of all the production after the scripts. And we worked very, very, very much as a team, Andy, Mike, and I, and to a somewhat lesser degree, Phil Harnage. But that was the sort of creative Deke team, and really everything Deke did started with those four people. And as I say, we would hire writers or hire outside people further, or the network might want us to use people. But that was really, if you look at all of Deke's output for the entirety of certainly the 90s, it all generated from those four people.
We get to the next one, the first Emmy winner. Where on earth is Carmen Sandiego?
Well, we'd already had success with Nintendo and Sega doing video games. And Carmen Sandiego, I think it was called, I know there was a PBS show that was called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and I think that's what their computer game was called too. All these shows were based on a computer game or a series of computer games, which at the time were different than video games. It was considered a different medium, although they were similar. But a computer game at the time was less visual, had less animation, and was more of an intellectual property and more of an educational property. But in this case, the game was very, very successful. So once again, Andy got the idea to approach Broderbund, which was the company that had created this and had the rights. And we acquired the rights to pitch it for Saturday morning property. And it was a natural for a children's television act show, an educational edutainment show. So we were able to place it on Fox Saturday Morning, which by then had become the best placement in Saturday morning. It had become the number one Saturday morning network, number one kids network on Saturday morning was Fox Kids. And it was headed up by Margaret Lesh, who was an old friend of Andy's from his days back when he worked at Hanna-Barbera. She was a network executive at NBC. So we had a great, great relationship with all the people at Fox. And They liked the pitch of Carmen Sandiego, and we developed it as we used some interesting computer graphics techniques and did some different things with it, and we came up with a very good formula for how to make it entertaining, and we used Don Roberts to make sure that it had the necessary and defensible educational components. In this case, one of the main curricula was geography. It was just it was one of those shows where everything just worked, and we had a really good team on it. And I can't tell you any particular fun or interesting anecdotes about it, but it's one of the shows I'm really proud of, and was recognized with an Emmy. That was the first time we won was Carmen, which was great.
How did it feel to win that Emmy, and were you there at the award when you won the Emmy?
I don't think I was. I think I wasn't at the award, but I think we must have been nominated more than once, because I do remember being at an award show. I had a real thrill one year. I took my mom to the Emmys in New York, and that was really fun for me, and it was certainly a thrill for her. And I remember you go to dinner. I think it was at the New York Hyatt Regency. I think we had dinner at the Hyatt Regency, a big Emmy dinner, and then you walked across the street to Radio City Music Hall where the ceremony was being held. And I remember at dinner we were sitting across at our table from Rita Moreno, who did the voice for Carmen. And, she's a huge, huge star, has been forever. And what's that? You'll know this, that award, that category where you've won an Oscar, a Tony, a Grammy, and an Emmy. There's an acronym for that.
TOME or MOTI or something like that.
Something like that. And very, very few people in the world that have won all 4 awards, and she was one of them. I don't know I'm not sure if it's because of Carmen that she got the Emmy, or she already had one. She probably already had one. But anyway, it was really fun to have dinner with her, with my mom. That was a real treat for me. And I don't think we won that year, though. So we must have been nominated more than once, because I don't think I was there for either of the Emmys we won, which is ironic because I went to so many of the award shows. And if I was there, I don't remember being there. So that's an even sadder statement. The awards I remember winning and going to receive, which was fun, were we won 2 environmental media awards for Captain Planet on successive seasons. And one of them was given by celebrities. I remember it was given to me by Jeff Goldblum and Jane Fonda, which was really pretty cool.
Bump in the Night.
Bump in the Night. We had nothing to do with that. That was one like Cowboys of Moo Mesa, where ABC had produced it, and when we were purchased by ABC, we became the distributor for it.
And I'm guessing What a Mess was a similar situation.
No, not true.
Okay.
That's not. No. What a Mess, that's an interesting story, sort of. What was interesting about What a Mess is, I believe I recall being at one of the big markets in Cannes that I mentioned that I used to go to twice a year in April and October. And I remember, and this is what's unusual, and it may have been after we were acquired by ABC that this happened, but I'm not sure. But what was unusual is ABC came to us and said, we have a property we really like. Why don't you get it? And we'll put it on the air. And that hardly ever happened, especially because they were doing their own production. They had in-house production. Typically, when that happened, they would get the property themselves and produce it themselves. But it was a really nice bone they threw to us. So they said, here's a property, go get it. So I remember being at that MIP and telling our business affairs attorney was there as well, and telling him to go get the rights for this thing, whatever it took. I mean, basically, I don't know if it was an on-air commitment, but it was pretty close. So it was one of these situations where get the rights to this immediately, lock it up. We want it. It was a book series by a British author. And what I remember the most about it is that the company that controlled the rights, that worked with the author, and I don't remember the name of the company, but the principal of the company that we dealt with was a woman named Joe Kavanaugh, and our business affairs attorney was a man named Greg Payne, and they sort of back and forth negotiation over the rights to this property. And the bottom line is they ended up falling in love and getting married and are still together to this day. And it was all over the property. So that's what I remember most about it. But we made the deal. We hired the 2 writers that had worked on Alvin and the Chipmunks that were known to ABC and known to us, Cliff Ruby and Elana Lesser. And Cliff was the son of Joe Ruby, who was the principal of Ruby and Spears, which had been a big animation studio that broke off of Hanna-Barbera. I think Joe Ruby started at Hanna-Barbera and broke off and started his own studio in the 70s, maybe early 80s. And Cliff was his son, and Elana was his wife, Elana Lesser. And they were a writing team that had done a lot of the Alvin and Chipmunks episodes. And we had worked with them then, and we had a great relationship with them and liked them a lot. And ABC liked them, so they were a good fit. We hired them to develop What a Mess, which was a book series, but needed a lot more to really sort of flesh it out for TV. And that's what I remember about What a Mess.
This is probably a question better apropos for Mr. Ruby, but was there any sort of bad blood or heated discussions over the fact that the son of a rival animation company was working for DiC?
Absolutely not. And I mean, I can't speak to their Thanksgiving dinners, but I mean, but Cliff and Elana worked a lot of different places, and by then I think Ruby and Spears had ceased to be a viable entity. But Cliff had his own career, and I don't, to my knowledge, it wasn't a problem. And certainly he worked other places other than DiC. They were a freelance team that worked for whoever wanted to hire their services, and I really can't imagine that it was a drama.
Did you, personally, I know DiC did, but did you have any affiliation with the Sailor Moon episodes that DiC ended up dubbing?
I didn't have too much to do with it. I mean, it was still under my watch there, and we hired some people that were kind of specialists in doing that sort of repurposing. But one of the roles that I played was helping to determine what was appropriate and what wasn't, because Sailor Moon had a lot of content in its original incarnation that would have been wholly and grossly considered inappropriate for children's television in America. And so I sort of had to keep on top of and make sure that the manner in which we repurposed it did not contain anything that would not be considered appropriate in our culture for children's television. But other than that, I didn't have a lot to do with it personally, but it happened while I was there. It was quite successful.
Did you work on Gadget Boy?
Yes, I worked on all the sort of Gadget sequels that DiC did. I did not work on the original Inspector Gadget because it was being done while I was doing He-Man at Filmation simultaneously. I think that was either the first or one of the first series that DiC produced. And they both were the first shows to go on 65 episodes in syndication in the afternoon. They simultaneously created that new market, both He-Man and Inspector Gadget. They were both quite successful. But the one contribution I have to Inspector Gadget, but sort of a quirky one, is that I was very good friends with Andy Hayward while he was developing and producing it, and I was working at Filmation. I was not working for Andy at the time, but we were friends, and we would talk quite frequently. And he told me about this show he was developing that he described as a cross between Inspector Clouseau and Get Smart. The main character was a cross between those two main characters. And he asked me if I had any thoughts for who might be a good voice for such a character. And I said, well, you said it's a cross between Clouseau and Get Smart. I said, you're not going to get Peter Sellers. He may have already been dead by then, but even if he wasn't, you weren't going to get Peter Sellers. I said, but why don't you try and get Don Adams? I said to Andy. And he said, that's a good idea. And sure enough, that became the voice of Inspector Gadget. So I don't know if they would have come to that on their own anyway, but it came out of a conversation that I had with Andy. But anyway, when I got to DiC, anytime that we did any sort of a Gadget, either a spin-off or a special, I was one of the executive producers, and I was in charge of the writing of it. I was sort of nominally in charge. I mean, there was one live-action thing we did, I think, that was called Gadget Boy in History or something where we did live. It was sort of a documentary kind of a show, very educational. And so we hired live-action people to do that sort of thing. But anything that was animation, I would hire the writers for sure.
Do you know how Gadget Boy and Heather came about? Reboot?
No, I don't remember.
Okay. I
mean, we had this great property that we owned, and it was a classic property. It was a great franchise. It had value. It had cachet. So, we were always trying to think of how we can continue to exploit that property, and we try to always find ways to take advantage of the property that we owned.
Now, did you work with Don Adams personally?
I never did, although there's one of the funny stories that I used to hear. There's a voice actor named Maurice LaMarche, if I'm not mistaken, whom I did work with many times. And he was an incredible mimic. and he could mimic Don Adams so well. It kind of got to the point, I think it first started where Don would come into the recording sessions, and, Don couldn't do any of this sort of animation, funny sound effects or weird stuff, or, talking like you're underwater, or, a lot of the stuff that you need from an animation voice. Don couldn't do that. So we get Maurice to come in and sort of do that kind of thing that Don couldn't do. And I used to hear stories. I was never there for this, but I used to hear stories from our voice director that Maurice and Don would be in the same session, and Don would just have Maurice do some of his regular lines because he just had him down so perfectly. And I think later when Don got ill and we couldn't use him, he wasn't as available to us. I think we got permission just to use Maurice to do his voice. So I think at least some of the episodes of the later spin-offs and things were actually Maurice and not Don.
I don't know if it's on the DVD, but I think there's a Mario Brothers Super Show where you have him in live action playing Inspector Gadget as well.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I have no recollection of it, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Sigfried and Roy, Masters of the Impossible. I know you had a story. I know we just lost Roy Horn.
Yeah. Have I already mentioned that? I don't remember. Did I talk to you about it?
Not in this interview. You mentioned it in the preparation for it, but not specifically.
Oh, right,
so
in the
you
email,
could talk
right.
about it.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, what was Sigfried and Roy, Masters of the Impossible? And second of all, what was your story about Roy Horn that you wanted to tell? But first of all, what was the program?
Oh, okay. Well, Sigfried and Roy were hugely popular magicians in Las Vegas. Magicians really doesn't do them justice. I mean, it was a spectacle. And as I've mentioned numerous times, Andy always had his radar up for properties that might appeal to kids that were sort of pre-sold that you could pitch to a network, because networks really liked pre-sold properties because there was more and more competition amongst so many different venues. There were cable channels now and video games and so many things competing for kids' eyeballs. Networks loved the idea of a pre-sold property because they felt it could help get them tuned in to in competition with all the other alternatives kids had to spend their time. Anyway, Andy, it may have been through CA, I'm not quite sure, but we made a deal with Sigfried and Roy, and as was the case with New Kids on the Block and with other properties too, the management of Sigfried and Roy, which was a man named Bernie Human, who was such a larger-than-life character. He was like your old, cliche of a Hollywood manager in the best way. I mean, he was colorful, he was brash, but he was really nice and really fun. And he kind of like owned Las Vegas. He was the king of Las Vegas because Sigfried and Roy were essentially the kings of Las Vegas at the time. They had the largest deal of any entertainer there. It was a multi-year deal. They basically built the Mirage Hotel around Sigfried and Roy and their show. And, it was sold out forever. And they were the toast of Las Vegas. And Bernie, as their manager, was arguably one of the most powerful people in Las Vegas. So anyway, Bernie insisted, part of the deal with Sigfried and Roy is he insisted that we come to see the show, that we get to know the guys, that we go out. They had an incredible mansion they had built in Las Vegas that they called the Jungle Palace, where they kept a lot of their tigers and animals, and they had this incredible swimming pool and fountains and artifacts from all over the world. I mean, it was indescribable. I mean, they would use film of it in their shows. It was famous. And also, in addition to that, Roy had built, completely separately, out in the desert, a replica Bavarian retreat that looked like you were in Bavaria, Germany. It was like a Disneyland incarnation of Germany out in the desert. And I think he kept his elephant out there. And I mean, it was a huge complex. And Roy invited us personally to go out. He took us out there personally. And I remember he sitting up in like a kind of a Bavarian attic in the desert, all air conditioned, and Roy opened a bottle of Dom Perignon for us and just talked with us about what he believed in, what was important to him, and what he wanted to communicate in the show, what the values that were important to Sigfried and Roy. And he was just Roy. I mean, they were both nice, but Roy in particular was such a gracious, warm, kind, gentle soul. I really was. I was heartbroken when the first tragedy had befallen him with the tiger attacking him. It broke my heart. And then, of course, recent to this interview. Within a week of this interview, he had just died from COVID. So it made me quite sad. I had such a lovely experience with them. We also got to go in their dressing room. We went to the show many, many times. We went to Las Vegas several times and saw their show several times. They really wanted us to immerse ourselves into the culture of Sigfried and Roy. They had their catchphrase was Sarmodi, which was an acronym for Sigfried and Roy, Masters of the Impossible. And that was sort of the ethos with which they wanted their series infused. It ended up being, I think it was like a 5-part miniseries on Fox or something. It wasn't a full series. It was a limited episode miniseries. It was sort of a magical fantasy sort of thing, which kind of was how their show, if you were to see their show, their show had a real sort of fantasy storytelling element to it. It wasn't like Modern Magicians. It sort of took place in another place, another sort of sword and sorcery kind of a vibe to it. So that's what we did with their series. And I just have to say we had a wonderful, wonderful, magical, no pun intended, experience with them and getting to look into their incredible world. And I mean incredible. It's amazing.
He will be missed.
He will be missed. Yeah. I mean, rest in peace. He was a gentle soul and an amazing talent. And poor Sigfried, they were so close. I mean, they were as close as two people could. I think it broke Siegfried's heart. I think it was just as hard on Siegfried as it was on Roy, the whole thing. It just really, really a tragedy.
What was the wacky world of Tex Avery?
We got some rights. We went to some, I don't know if it was his daughter or granddaughter of Tex Avery. I think, don't hold me to this, but for some reason I have a feeling she was living in France. I don't know why I think that. But Tex Avery was hugely popular in France. He was one of the original Warner Brothers animators, the Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes and all that. Just in one of these classic, brilliantly funny Warner's animators like Chuck Jones and Friz Freleng from that era. And I have to say, I have always loved that style of cartoon. That's always been my favorite style of cartoon, those old, and a lot of people feel that way, those old classic squash and stretch style cartoons. And France was a huge market for us. And I think Andy got the idea, because Tex Avery was so popular in France, to try and develop a new series that was sort of an homage. We obviously couldn't use any of the Warner Brothers characters. Those weren't our characters. But our concept was to develop a series that was an homage to those old shorts. And this series would be all short episodes, and we would come up with a cast of characters like Looney Tunes. But our characters would all be original. And I think we ended up with either 6 or 7 different original characters, one of whom we actually called Tex Avery, and that was a Western motif. And each one of these characters had their own cartoons, their own shorts, and they were different motifs. And I have to say it was one of my absolute favorite projects ever to work on. We hired a guy by the name of Eddie Fitzgerald, who was well known in animation as kind of the master of this style of animation and a fan, somebody who really respected and loved this old style of animation. And Eddie, I'd heard of him. I think I'd crossed paths with him at Filmation or something. I mean, I sort of had met him, but I hadn't really ever worked with him, even though I'd heard of him for years and years and years and years. And we hired him to work on, we originally called it Tex Avery Theater. That was the working title of it. And we hired several different writers to work on it. And I think we all got in a room and came up with the 5 different or 6 different characters that were going to be, each that were going to have their own set of shorts. And I think that the plan was going to be there was going to be 3 shorts in every half-hour episode. And we would just rotate all these characters. There was going to be 65 episodes. Each one would have 3 episodes, and each 3 episodes would be different characters rotated among the 6 or 7, if that's all making sense to you. Anyway, we would have meetings with Eddie. This is the only time I remember doing this, really. Well, one other time. But this is the first time I remember doing it, which was we just get in a meeting with a bunch of people and just spitball ideas for these characters, when we were first coming up with who these characters would be. And Eddie Fitzgerald just had this way of acting out the expressions and the gestures. And, conversation can't do it how funny Eddie could be in coming up with these ideas and characters and their affectations. And he would perform them in the room. And I mean, I don't remember laughing so hard for anything, any professional meeting in my entire life. I would just be just rolling, pounding the table at Eddie's antics and how he would imitate the way these characters would do and the stupid things they would say. And it was a joy. It was an absolute joy working on the development of that series. Once we got all the characters sort of worked out, then it became, we had to do 65 episodes or whatever the number was. It might have been 40, but it was a large number of episodes in a short period of time. So it became this incredible grind to try and get all this work done. And I couldn't be as hands-on as I would have enjoyed being because it was just too much work and there was too many other things I had to do. But during the development period, I was quite active in it. And it was just sheer fun. And the whole goal of that series, it wasn't intended to be an educational series, unlike most of the series we were doing during that era, which were designated as, quote, FCC friendly, which meant complying with the Children's Television Act. But this show was just designed to be pure, fun, clever entertainment. We tried to make the humor sort of work on two levels, just the way those old Warner Brothers cartoons did. And we were irreverent and we were sort of subversive. And, a lot of people questioned what we were doing and felt it was sacrilege. And we got a little bit of a bad rap, I'd say, within the industry because people so revered Tex Avery. And I think people felt, we were exploiting the name. But I personally am very, very proud of that series. I think given the limitations we had, there's some really, really funny shows in that batch of all the different characters, all different episodes. I mean, they weren't all winners, but I think we had a lot that were really funny and really entertaining, and one of my favorite shows to have worked on. Oh, I just remembered a really interesting story about Tex Avery. This is a good story. This is a very interesting story. This was, I think, about maybe 9 months after 9/11, after the Twin Towers tragedy of 9/11. I got a call. It was referred up to me. Somebody else at Deke had first taken this call, and they referred it to me. I wasn't even working full-time at Deke at that point. I had already moved to Seattle, but somehow I still was given this call, and I still had I retained my title, which was Executive VP, even though I wasn't working there full-time. Anyway, I get a call from somebody from the Defense Department of the U.S., Pentagon, and they're trying to investigate the 9/11 attack and Al-Qaeda and, how they got the idea and all this sort of thing. And somebody had reported to them that one of our episodes of Wacky World Tex Avery, one of our recurring characters was a kind of a superhero spoof called Power Pooch, exactly. And it was a spoof of a superhero. And I didn't even remember this, but apparently, and this happened before 9/11, apparently we had an episode where two guys hijacked a plane and flew it over the New York skyline, low over the New York skyline. And there were apparently scenes in this cartoon that were very similar to what happened with that horrible tragedy. And General, or whatever he was from the Defense Department, wanted to know all about whose idea was it, where did this come from. I mean, I think they were actually investigating, or at least contemplating, that somehow our cartoon had served as inspiration for Al-Qaeda. I mean, and by the way, not to suggest that I believe that was the case, or even that they believed that was the case. And I can't imagine that Al-Qaeda ever saw the cartoon, but I just thought it was incredible that I got such a telephone call, and that such a possibility was even considered. But it just goes to show why networks and broadcasters are so sensitive to what they put on the air in children's programs.
Truth is stranger than fiction as well.
Yeah, that was a strange call. That was one of the stranger calls I ever got.
We brought up Tex Avery being popular in France, and you brought up Deke having a big market share in France. Where was Deke the most popular?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but I can tell you that that Canada was a great territory for us, and France was a great territory for us, and Italy was pretty good. We did pretty well in Europe, and I'd say we did pretty well internationally in general. We did quite well internationally. I'd say France and Canada would be the two that would come to mind most prominently.
Why do you think that was for those two?
I have no idea.
Well, going somewhere with that, Mummies Alive I know was big in Canada.
Yes, it was.
Do you have any memories of Mummies Alive?
Once again, Andy Hayward's idea. He'd taken his kids to a mummy exhibit. I think it was the King Tut Museum that was exhibit that was touring around then, I believe. Anyway, some big Egyptian museum exhibit. He'd taken his kids to. His kids had gone wild over it, and Andy said, "Let's develop something with mummies." And we all thought that was a great idea.
Did you work with Ivan Reitman on that directly?
That's right. You reminded me. Thanks for reminding me. Well, we hired Ivan Reitman's. We had done a lot of things with Ivan Reitman, predominantly Ghostbusters, and mostly we had worked with his two lieutenants named Joe Medjuk and Michael Gross. Michael was somebody that I had gone way back with at Filmation before he went to work for Ivan Reitman. I had developed something with him at Filmation, and we'd become friendly. We had a very good rapport and working relationship. And he went on to become Ivan Reitman's, along with Joe Medjuk. They were the main guys at Ivan Reitman that did everything on behalf of Ivan. And they were the guys that had worked with us very closely on Ghostbusters. And we developed a couple other things with them as well. And we thought they would be a good fit for Mummies Alive. We thought it had the same kind of tone as Ghostbusters. And we'd had such a great experience working with both of these guys. We made a deal with Ivan Reitman to basically, put Ivan's name as a co-producer and get these guys to help us with the development. And since it's an original property, it was much, much, much harder to market original properties, always. And so I think one of the reasons to get Ivan Reitman was it helped give a sort of a cachet and a credibility to an otherwise original property that had no sort of star power attached to it. Ivan Reitman was sort of the star power. It may have been the first time that we hired Eric and Julia Lewald, who became great friends and are still friends. And oh my goodness, were they a terrific story editing team? Just wonderful. They'd had a wonderful reputation I'd heard about for years, and I don't think I'd worked with them prior to that. We loved working with them. We think they did a terrific job being in charge of. They developed the concept and were in charge of all the scripts. And in fact, Eric was later hired to, when I left Deke, Eric was one of the people that was hired to fill my position for a period of time. It's interesting as I talk to, I don't know if this is true of most people that you interview, but it seems that most of my memories are around people more than anything else. I seem to remember the people that I dealt with more than most things.
You aren't alone.
Okay, good.
You talked briefly about writing the theme, but just quick glance on Sonic Underground. Do you remember how that came about? Because that was 6 years after.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons it came about is Sonic had been a really great seller for us internationally. It really had done well internationally. It continued to do well even after it was no longer on the network and no longer in syndication, but it was very, very popular in France, extremely popular. And we had now we had a great relationship with Sega thanks to Cynthia and to Jane Thompson. Everything was great with Sega, and it was a great property. And we kind of thought about Alvin and the Chipmunks, and our thought was, I wonder if there's a way to take Sonic the Hedgehog and sort of infuse it with the music, the way Alvin and the Chipmunks did, and relaunch it as a musical property. And that's what we did. And I think Phil Harnage kind of came up with the concept, story idea, and it may have been his title, too. I thought it was a great title, Sonic Underground, because it has so many connotations. It just sounded good. And I submitted the song under a nom de plume, and the song was chosen. Everybody really liked the song before they knew it was mine even, and that was great. And because everybody did know at Deke that I was a music person, I was sort of put in charge of the music approvals for that series. We came up with the idea that every episode would have a song in it, a little performance song, like Alvin and the Chipmunks. And we sort of tried to have the scripts have motifs to them that would suit a certain style of music, like something that would fit a Beach Boys style of song or something that might fit a reggae song or whatever. And we used a wonderful composer named Mike Piccirillo, a.k.a. Pick. And I was in charge of approving all the songs, which we didn't normally have a song in every episode, so that was kind of a new thing for me. And it was really fun because Pick did great work, and I really felt like we were on the same wavelength for what kinds of things we were looking for each episode. And rarely did I have problems with what he submitted, and when I did, because I was a musician and am a musician, I was able to communicate very, very clearly to him what I thought might work better or what I thought the problem was. And we were, I loved working with Jane Thompson with Sega, so it was really a super, super fun show for me to work on, and I have extremely fond memories of it, and mostly because of having the song, the title song. It's a really big deal to me because that's really what I always wanted to do. The writing, the script writing, and the TV and all that. It was a wonderful career. But my passion was and is to this day songwriting. So Sonic Underground stands alone of all my animation work because my song was in it.
What year do you remember the year you started teaching at UCLA or started lecturing there?
I don't remember the year, no.
Do you remember how you ended up?
Somebody contacted me. UCLA has a program called the Writers Program. It's actually part of UCLA Extension. And it was it's got a great reputation because being in LA, you could get all sorts of industry people and people with real credits teaching screenwriting and, all the various aspects of screenwriting. And somebody I knew somebody that taught there as well. She may have been the one that recommended me. I think she taught sitcoms there. And they called me and asked me if I'd be interested in teaching an animation writing class. And I was interested in it. And I thought I was a good person to do it because I'd worked for many years as a writer, but I'd also worked as an executive hiring writers. So I really felt like I had both sides of the desk perspective. There's some old adage about for every hour you teach, it takes 4 hours of preparation, or there's some formula like that teachers talk about. And boy, did I ever find that to be true. I agree. I only agreed to teach a one-day class because I was so busy in my job. I just didn't want to take out time during the week. And I also didn't want a class where I was going to have to review any student work because I already had piles and piles and piles of things I had to read for my job. I could not possibly have taken on more reading. So the only way I could do it would be if I sort of taught a one-day per semester class on the weekend, and that's what I told them that would be the only way I could do it, and they said they agreed to that. So I prepared an 8-hour class, and I'm a sort of an OCD person, and so the way I prepared my notes was I literally on the top of every single page of my notes I put a time of the time on the clock of what time I should be at the top of that page. I tried to be extremely structured and organized about it, and I have to say, I think it really worked out well. I learned the first time. I had to make a few adjustments after the very first time I taught it, but mostly my timing worked out well. I think I structured a really, really good class and covered really a lot of material in the time I had. I had a lot of handouts. UCLA produced the handouts, and this was before the era of PowerPoints. This was, photocopied handouts era. And I would get, you'd get evaluations. All students would fill out evaluations from the class. And I think I did this maybe 4 or 5, 6 times. I don't remember quite how many, but I did it many times. And my evaluations, I have to say, were just so gratifying. I mean, the students really, really seemed to appreciate the work I put into structuring this class. The great thing about it was students were paying to go to this class. I mean, it was not required by anybody. It was completely something that they wanted to do. So you would get extremely motivated, attentive, bright students who would ask good questions and really be interested and fascinated by everything you wanted to hear that I was telling them. They really wanted to hear what I had to say. So I really, really enjoyed it. It was extremely, extremely gratifying.
We'll go a little bit more in depth when we reach the end and talk about the advice you have, but do you remember what specifically you talked about in your teaching course?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I talked about, I think the morning was about craft. It was divided into 2 halves, the morning and afternoon. There was a lunch break, and I think the morning was about craft. And I talked all about how you write an animation script and what stages there are and how I got my ideas and what techniques and tricks I used. And I handed out samples of script pages and, the format and all the sort of tools of how animation scripts are created and how one would go about writing one. That was kind of the morning. And in the afternoon, I talked more about the business and how you market yourself as a writer and how to get work and what it was like to work as a writer and sort of all the sort of professional aspects of being an animation writer. It was really, I have to say, chock full of content. There was no padding. Plus, UCLA would sometimes ask me to get guest speakers in the afternoon. And one time I was able to get Linda Wolverton, whom I knew. She used to be a Saturday morning writer. She went on to write Beauty and the Beast, the animated Beauty and the Beast, and I think Lion King she wrote as well. I mean, she became a superstar screenwriter. I mean, huge screenwriter who happened to do animation. She was really gracious to come to my class and speak to them at one of the times. And UCLA was overjoyed when I was able to get her, and so was I, and so were the students. She was wonderful. And I got a couple of writers named Schooley and McCorkle, Bob Schooley and Mark McCorkle, who started off as runners at Deke, drivers. And we gave them their first script, and they were so talented, those guys. So talented. Such great writers. And great guys to boot. Super gracious, modest, wonderful to work with guys. They went on to Disney. They were hired away from us. To my great disappointment, they were hired away by Disney. By the way, I say disappointment, not anger. I mean, Disney was a much better opportunity for them. They were paying them more. I wished them nothing but well when they left, but I was really sad to lose them. But they became huge TV stars at Disney in terms of animation writing and showrunners. So they were really big when they came back to my class, which was fun. And I got one other really big person who I can't even remember now one of the times. So some of the times I would get a guest speaker in the afternoon, mostly because UCLA liked that because it helped them to advertise.
What point did you leave Deke and become part-time, and why?
Yes, well, the why, of course I remember. The reason I left Deke is, I really didn't like living in Los Angeles. I really didn't like it. I'd grown up there, but it just had changed so much over the years, and to my way of thinking and the lifestyle I like, it just had become untenable. I just was miserable there. I don't even like the weather there. And professionally, I was completely exhausted and burnt out, totally. I'd been at Deke I started at Deke in 86, so I'd been doing Deke for 14 years at that time, I guess. I think I'd produced, I'd been one of the producers I worked on 2,500 half hours of television spread over probably 30 series and properties, or maybe more if you include specials, and dealt with all the rights holders, all the networks. I mean, my job was exciting and fulfilling and full of so much color and adventure, but it was really challenging and could be really stressful too. And I'd been looking forward to leaving around 2000. There was Andy's deal structured with Disney such that in 2000, I think Disney either had to buy out the company completely, or else Andy had to buy it back or something. There was some termination point in 2000 where something was going to happen that made that the right time to leave. And so I had sort of discussed with Andy my desire to leave at that time, starting a couple years prior. I had bought a house in Seattle as far back as 1990, the house I knew I wanted to live in the Seattle area. And that was my dream, to leave LA, to live in Seattle, and not to work so intensely. And so I made an arrangement with Andy, which worked out great for me, and I hope it worked out great for him. I think it did, where I would relinquish my full-time duties, relinquish a large portion of my salary, move to Seattle, still work for Deke on a part-time basis. I still did a lot of traveling on behalf of Deke. I would still go to the markets twice a year and go visit clients and help to pitch the company with Andy. And I did a lot of press interview stuff. That was always one of the things I did, was spokesperson. I continued to do that. I continued to be the sort of internal expert on all the educational shows and the Children's Television Act, which I'd become quite knowledgeable about, and had good connections in in those communities and with those things. So I handled a lot of that. But I didn't do the day-to-day development and the day-to-day shows and the day-to-day client interface. That's what I mostly gave up. And as I say, from my point of view, it worked out great. I was making substantially less money, but that was okay. And I had substantially less stress. So it seemed to be a fair trade-off. I continued in that role from 2000 until 2008 when Deke was sold to Cookie Jar. And I didn't really have a relationship with the guys that bought it, and I don't think they really saw a value in keeping me on that basis. So my time with Deke ended when Cookie Jar bought it.
Had they asked you, would you have still been interested in being part of it, or were you pretty well ready to leave behind it?
If I could have done it on the basis that I was doing it, yes, I would have continued doing it on that. But I didn't want to, do anything more active or full-time.
We skipped a few shows. I hope it's okay if we jump back a little bit and talk about just a couple more.
Whatever you like. Anything you like.
Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century.
We did a series prior to Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. We did a series called The Hurricanes, which was about a soccer team. And we did it as a co-production with Scottish television. And I forget how we originally got involved with them. It was, I think it was a previous show called Captain Z in the Z Zone or something like that. We had some, I think they distributed it in Scotland for us, or we had some very peripheral engagement with them, and we all really hit it off. Our two companies really hit it off. In particular, their counterpart to me was a man named Sandy Ross, and it was just uncanny how Sandy and I hit it off and just clicked as creatively and personally. I mean, we just shared. Sandy was a big music fan, and we shared a lot of music stuff, and his sense of humor was just exactly as mine was, and his kind of role in his company and his relationship to his boss was the same as mine. I mean, it's really hard to articulate what a meeting of the minds and spirit I had with Sandy Ross at Scottish Television. We became super close friends and are to this day, even though he lives in Edinburgh. We correspond all the time. And we're both skiers, and we started going on ski trips together once we started working together. And, we'd hang out at the markets. We'd go to all the markets together, and he was my best buddy at the market. And, we'd go to parties, have meals, and whatever. Anything we could do together, we did, just because we really enjoyed each other's company. Anyway, we'd go skiing together. This is all leading up to Sherlock Holmes. We went skiing together, and I'll never forget it. We were riding a ski lift, and Sandy said, "I've got an idea for a series." He pitched it to me on a ski lift riding up the mountain. And his idea was a futuristic Sherlock Holmes. And I said, well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. I said, I don't know if Sherlock Holmes is going to be that commercial for Americans. It's much more commercial, I think, for the United Kingdom. But I pitched it to Andy. I mentioned it to Andy, and Andy said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So we were off and running, and we developed it. And, of course, working with Sandy couldn't have been a bigger dream. I mean, it was great. And we put Phil Harnage on and Martha Moran, who was my co-writer way back from the days on Snow White feature film at Filmation. When I was allowed to hire any writer I wanted, I gave Martha essentially her first gig as my co-writer on Snow White, and she worked on many things at Deke since then. So I put her and Phil together on Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. I think it might have been my idea. I'm not sure. It might have been Sandy's to actually use all of the Conan Doyle stories. Conan Doyle had many, many Sherlock Holmes stories, more than enough to inspire all the episodes we were doing. So our gimmick was to take the real Sherlock Holmes stories and just put a sci-fi twist on them and reimagine them in the futuristic sci-fi genre. And they're all public domain stories, so we were welcome to do what we wanted with them. And I was super, super proud of that series. And it was nominated for an Emmy. Didn't win, but it was nominated, which was pretty good because it did not have a great visibility in the U.S. It wasn't, I guess we had it sold in syndication, but it was not a great syndication placement. It didn't get a lot of ratings. It wasn't, to my mind, that well, didn't have that high of a profile, but it still got an Emmy nomination, which I was thrilled about.
Sabrina the Animated Series?
Yes. I believe at that time it was an ABC primetime series, and it was the part that I'm saying I believe, I think it was on ABC. I know it was a primetime series, and it was extremely successful in primetime. It was a big hit, huge hit. And we had this wonderful background with the Archie Comics people who owned the underlying rights. And I believe we had been acquired by ABC by that time. I'm sure we had. And so we were the natural fit to do an animated series. And I don't remember if we pitched it or they came to us. I think we probably pitched it. And they bought it. And at some point, Disney acquired ABC while we were producing it, because I remember that our creative supervision was directly from Disney. And in fact, the guy giving us notes, the guy that was heading it up from Disney's point of view, was a guy named Roy Price, who was the son of Frank Price, who had been a huge, huge studio boss in the 80s, I think, during the era of E.T. and things like that. I think I came under his watch. He was at Universal, I believe, or Columbia, or maybe both. Anyway, his son was a guy named Roy Price, and he was our supervisor on Sabrina, and I got to know him quite well. He has kind of an interesting history. He ended up being hired by Amazon when Amazon went into all their video production, and he became the head of Amazon Studios and a huge force in the animation industry when Amazon was on the rise and was becoming dominant amongst the streaming services. And then Roy had a terrible fall from grace as one of the first casualties of the Me Too movement. He'd made a deal with Harvey Weinstein and was friendly with Harvey. And after Harvey got called out publicly, shortly thereafter, a woman producer that had worked with Roy made some claims about him, things he said and things, nothing that he did. I should be very clear. No actual action, but just things that he said that were inappropriate, and it became quite a scandal. I mean, in light of sort of all the Me Too things that happened afterwards, Roy probably would not have been a big deal, but because it was literally the second one after Harvey Weinstein, it became quite a big story, and Roy was fired from Amazon. And I think he's like an antique art dealer in Hong Kong now or something. I looked him up because I was curious. I had dinner with him when he was in Seattle while I was working for Amazon. Anyway, I'm digressing from Sabrina, but that's what I remember about it. We used a couple of primetime writers, Savage Steve Holland. I always loved that nickname, Savage Steve. People would actually call him Savage, and he was the sweetest guy. But he was our main writer. And we used another primetime writer named Kevin Murphy, whom I had given one of his first gigs to several years prior. Before he was a big shot in primetime, I'd given him and his partner at the time a development gig at Deke because I was really impressed with them. And I'd stayed friends with Kevin. And Kevin now had a good primetime resume, and he came back and he and Savage worked together as doing the scripts for Sabrina. And a woman named Diane Dixon, who's a wonderful woman who ended up with a radio gig in L.A., a big radio gig in L.A., and just a terrific writer. I think she'd written on the Alvin and the Chipmunks as well. So those were our three. We had three different writers on Sabrina, three different story editors. In animation, story editors are the people that are in charge of the scripts, and they may or may not write them, but they will hire the freelance writers and they'll rewrite them. And basically, you delegate scripts to the story editors in animation. They're kind of akin in a way to showrunners in primetime to some degree, although in animation they have far less power and less influence than do showrunners in primetime. But they're sort of showrunners of the scripts, you would say. We used Melissa Joan Hart to do more than one voice, I think, and I got to know Paula Hart, who was her mom and manager. Paula lived about 6 blocks away from me in L.A., and I got to know her, and we socialized a little bit. She was a lovely person. I didn't really get to know Melissa that well, but she did voices for us, and it was fine. And her younger sister did voice for us as well. The other thing I remember is while I was working in Seattle, when I was working part-time, when time permitted and there wasn't enough duties to sort of justify the salary I was paying, I would write scripts for existing series, just so they could get value out of what they were paying me. And that was one of the series I wrote a script for, was Sabrina, in one of its later incarnations. I think it was called Sabrina's Secret Life or something like that. This was after the network series. We did a syndicated series later on that I believe was called Sabrina's Secret Life or something like that. And that was I think that was the last script I ever wrote, was one of the ones for Sabrina's Secret Life. And it was really fun to write the script. I had a really good time with it. I was not given a formal credit for that script, though, for business reasons that I cannot go into. So I did not get a script credit, but I absolutely wrote the whole thing, beginning to end.
Do you remember how many scripts you wrote while you were at Deke? I know that it wasn't your primary function, but was that the only script you wrote at Deke?
I wrote a script for a live-action series that we did that I'm not proud of at all. In fact, this might be the most embarrassing series that Deke ever did. I don't know. But it was a live-action series called Tattooed Teenage Alien Fighters from Beverly Hills. And the reason I wrote a script for that, and I didn't typically want to write scripts for a series that I was producing or really any of the Deke series, because I felt there were two reasons I didn't want to do it. One is I didn't like the idea of taking away a script from a freelance writer, that would otherwise have gotten paid for it. And B, I felt it was kind of a conflict of interest. I felt I was better served to be objective about other people's scripts rather than my own. The reason I made the exception on Tattooed Teenage Alien Fighters of Beverly Hills was because it was a live-action Writers Guild show, and I was in the Writers Guild. And if I didn't get a credit at some point, my status in the Writers Guild was going to be reduced, and I really wanted to keep my status in the Writers Guild as current at the time. So I indulged myself and basically essentially assigned myself a script, one of the scripts for that series, although I did it under a nom de plume. And the other script, Sabrina, I wrote, and I think the only other thing I wrote while at Deke, again, happened after I moved to Seattle when I was part-time. I rewrote one of the Liberty's Kids scripts. It was a rewrite, and I think I shared the credit with the original writers, but it was almost a page-run rewrite. I consider it largely my script.
Are you legally allowed to, or at liberty to, give the name of your pseudonym, or would you rather not?
I prefer not to. I'm at liberty to, but I opt not to.
Okay, that's perfectly okay. Well, you brought up not being proud of the aforementioned Tattooed Teenage Alien Fighters, but I wanted to ask you about this, and I know you said you were okay with me, but Deke, I know you had to have heard this at some point, the moniker Deke that people alleged, obviously this isn't what it actually meant, but people allege in the industry to some extent that stood for do it cheap.
Sure. By the way, there were a million of those. There was Death in Cartoons, Do I Care? There were a whole bunch of DIC acronym, alleged, fun things that people would use to make fun of Deke and make fun of the acronym.
Well, what are your thoughts on some of the criticisms that Deke received during your tenure?
Well, I think a lot of them were fair. Here's what I think. I mean, Deke's basic business plan was to do huge quantity of largely work-for-hire shows for which we received very low money and had just insane schedules that we had to respect in order to deliver on time. I mean, we almost always got our orders late. Truly, as big a challenge in animation as budget is time. I mean, no matter how much money you have, it's like the old parable about the 5-minute egg, or 4-minute egg, whatever it's called. You need 4 minutes to make it. It's just, even with money, you can't cut certain corners in terms of schedule and animation. And so we were always challenged both in terms of money, schedule. And I think given that, we did a lot of great things. And many of our series I'm really proud of. And I think what happened to some degree with Deke is I think people generalized and stereotyped us because a lot of the shows we did were not particularly good, and a lot of them were based on properties that really did not lend themselves well to animated series, but they were just hot properties, and Andy was able to get an order. And, Andy's job was basically to keep the studio afloat, to keep money coming in, to keep the payroll being made. We never ever missed payroll, which I'm very proud of. We kept many, 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 many people employed over the years. We started the careers of lots and lots of people from Chuck Lorre on down, and we did some really wonderful, great shows, things like Where on Earth is Carmen Sandiego and Madeline and Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century and even Wacky World of Tex Avery, which, I think was a terrific show given the challenges that we had and a really entertaining show. And the other thing is, Andy, we were non-union, and Andy had a reputation as a challenging boss to work for, and we could be challenging. We We did ask a lot of our employees. There's no question about it. And so, I think there was certainly some ill will. There's always going to be some ill will. As I always say, show me a person with no enemies, and I'll show you a person I don't trust. So, we had our share of enemies and people that resented the way that we did things or didn't like the way we did things. And I think a lot of that could generalize into criticism of our shows. And I think some of it was fair. And I think some of our shows were not things that I'm proud of particularly. But I think a lot of our really great work got overlooked in the sort of broad industry. And I think a lot of people were jealous, frankly, in the industry because we had incredible success during the 90s. And during the late 80s and 90s, I don't think there was any independent studio anywhere near as successful as Geek was, just in terms of output. I mean, we were incredibly successful in terms of our output, and it was such a challenging industry. It was so hard to stay afloat and stay funded. And, we were employing hundreds of people. You can't do that without making enemies and without some people resenting your success.
How much had Saturday morning television changed by the year 2000?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. Certainly from when I started in 1980, the single biggest change was the proliferation of outlets, because in 1980 it was 3 networks and that was it. Literally, if you couldn't get your show on one of the 3 networks, you weren't in business. And oh my God, had that changed by 2000 with all the cable outlets and the home video and the online and international becoming such a much larger piece of the puzzle, and licensing becoming that was a huge shift around the era of He-Man, when licensing became such a huge revenue generator, and this whole concept of pre-sold properties became so important during the 80s and 90s. So those are, and sort of the maturation of CGI and that becoming a viable option for series TV. That was at first not a viable option for series TV because it was A, too expensive, and B, too limited in what it could do in terms of series. And just the way technology was used to produce cartoons. I mean, there were no more cells. The idea of all the coloring and so much being done digitally now, I mean, that was a huge shift. So I guess when I think about it, the industry had completely transformed by the time I left in 2000 from when I started in 1980, and that's only 20 years. It completely transformed in many, many ways.
Were you involved with the animation process? And I have a follow-up for this. Did you go to the animation studios in Taiwan, Japan, Korea?
No,
okay.
I did not. Nope, no. I did. I was involved. I was never really involved ever, but at least at Filmation, it was all done in the building. Everything was done in the building. So as I mentioned earlier, I could go around to every department and understand what they did and see what they did and sort of feel like I was part of that process, even though I wasn't really part of it. But once I got to Deke, no, I had nothing to do with any of that.
The reason I ask is, there's an episode of Super Mario Brothers Super Show, and this is one of the things that has stayed in my mind forever, which is the animation on that one, and it's something I've never seen before subsequent. You have one character speaking, and you have one character moving their mouth, but the dialogue from another character is coming out of their mouth. I don't know if...
You mean it's just a mistake, you mean?
Yeah, it's a mistake. But it happens a lot in this one episode. And it's one of those things that's
very interesting. Was it on broadcast that way, or in home? How did you see it in that way?
It's on the DVD. I don't know if it would ever broadcast that way. I assume it did.
Well, here is my answer. Here's my response to that. We did do post-production in L.A., and that would have been the kind of thing that certainly I would have expected to have been caught and fixed in post-production. And the fact that it wasn't, I don't know about it. It's the first I've heard of it. I have no explanation for why it wasn't caught, and I just find it odd. I find that extremely odd that something like that would get through. I'm wondering if it's something that might have happened after we supplied the elements for the DVD, and somehow in the DVD production it got screwed up. I mean, does it look like the kind of thing that was messed up in post?
No, it looks like the kind of thing that was like an animator had the track in their ear and kept animating, but then animated the next character, but with the previous set of dialogue. Because the mouth movement matches the other character's dialogue. I could show you a clip of it sometime, if I can find it online.
Interesting. I don't know anything about it. It's the first I've heard of it. That's pretty interesting to me. Pretty embarrassing.
Well, I'm curious if that happened often where something came back and you went, oh, no.
It could happen. I tell you, I remember some of the things we were so late on getting orders, and this is more of the network shows that were being broadcast on Saturday morning. But I remember, and I'm just not exaggerating this. I mean, normally you'd want 2 or 3 weeks to post-produce a show when we got the elements back from Asia or wherever, mostly Asia. Usually, and build in your schedule 2 to 3 weeks of post-production. But we were having such problems on shows that I remember there were times when we would get shows on a Thursday night, you ship back on a plane from Asia. We would send a helicopter to LAX to pick up the film, and we would start post on Thursday night to be on the air that Saturday, the day, within 40 hours, whatever the heck it was. And it was just absolutely insane. Needless to say, we would all work around the clock, literally around the clock. And I mean, there were times when Mike Maliani tells stories about when he was scratching things on negatives on the film, trying to fix the film by literally scratching and changing the film. So this very well could have been one of those situations where we got the film back so late that we had to just do a mad dash through post. The fact that we were even able to deliver these shows, I mean, we would then deliver them to the network satellite, like a couple hours before they were on the air or something. I mean, I don't even know how we did it. I don't know how they passed it through broadcast standards and practices. I mean, it was just crazy, some of the madcap rushes to delivery stories that we used to endure. And endure would be the right word, because it was just so incredibly stressful and exhausting to do it that way. And it's just so difficult to get a good product when you work that way. And it would be so easy to let some mistake go through like that. I mean, we would have had no choice.
Archie's Weird Mysteries. One that I distinctly remember from childhood.
Oh, the series?
Yeah.
I have no recollection at all. I mean, I know we did it. I remember, the idea was, the pitch was Stephen King meets the Archies, and we thought it was really I really liked the idea. The other sort of creative thought was to try to think back to these sort of really fun horror movies of the 50s, of the late 50s, like The Blob and The Incredible Shrinking Man and The Amazing Colossal Beast. I had grown up on those films. I was 9 years old in '59 or whatever, and I loved those sort of what would now be deemed very corny horror movies. But they were teenage. They just had this sort of teenage color to them, and they always had teenage couples. And we thought, what a great vibe this would be. The Archies and those sort of 50s sci-fi movies. That was the sort of creative premise and the tone that we were shooting for. And I think we did a pretty good job, and I liked it. But, I guess there were absolutely no controversies on that series whatsoever, and no horrible challenges. And so I don't remember that much about it. You tend to only remember the ones that really caused problems or had something especially unique about the production. And I would say neither of those statements is true about Archie's Weird Mysteries. I think it was a good show. I think it was a fun show, and I think it was relatively problem-free.
Liberty's Kids.
Liberty's Kids was the brainchild of a guy named Kevin O'Donnell, who had worked for Deke since the days before I got there in various capacities. Occasionally worked full-time, but mostly just as a freelancer. And he was just kind of a friend of the court. He was a friend of Andy's, and he was, and I'm sure still is, I haven't talked to him in a while, but he was an incredibly creative, colorful, hip, funny, charming idea man. That was Kevin's great gift, I think, was being an idea man. He just would come up with great ideas, and he was so personable and charming in his demeanor that he could pitch them, and you'd want to be in business with Kevin, because he just exuded the air of a winner and of a smart guy. Anyway, it was completely his idea, Liberty Kids. He pitched it to Andy. Andy loved it. I think I may have already been in Seattle by then, or else was very close to leaving. And I didn't have very much to do with it. I think I ended up with a credit on it, and to be honest, I don't really feel, if I did end up with one, I don't feel I deserved it, but because I had really very little to do with it. I may have helped sell it at the beginning. I do remember being at a pitch meeting, I think, with PBS, so maybe I helped try to sell it. I think that was the first series we did with PBS, as I recall. And they were a challenging client.
How so?
Very restrictive. I mean, they're not ratings dependent. So, maybe I shouldn't even say restrictive, but I should just say they came at everything from a very, very different mindset. Our mindset was always a commercial mindset and a need to get ratings. Our shows, for the clients, all the clients we'd had prior to PBS, the goal of the show from the broadcaster point of view and from the client's point of view was to generate ratings. And that was always where our head was at, and that was always how we were thinking about things. And we were commercially oriented, and PBS does not have that priority. Their priority is purely one of content, and that's great. That's wonderful. And they produce incredibly great shows, but they don't always get great ratings. In fact, they usually don't get great ratings. So it was just, I think I should just define it as a different mindset that we were approaching it with, and it took a little while for us to adjust to their mindset and what they were looking for and how they wanted to work. But once we did, it was fine. I remember also we got a history consultant that was fantastic. We got a history consultant from Harvard that was an expert on the Revolutionary era, and I don't remember his name, but he was noted scholar on this era, and he worked out great. But I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we would quite often work with educational consultants. In most cases, it was Don Roberts. But on a show like this, where the history was such an important part of the curriculum, and PBS was absolutely finicky about having accurate history, to their credit, Don was not qualified to do that kind of consulting. So we did get somebody else, and it was a real key to making it work with these consultants is finding the right consultant, because some of the consultants could be very tunnel visioned, and they're experts in their area, but they know nothing about storytelling, and their advice and their input was counter to good storytelling and would sometimes interfere with the storytelling and the edutainment aspects of it. Whereas other consultants totally grasped the concept of edutainment, Don Roberts being the foremost in that category. I mean, he was a master of edutainment. But the history fellow that we got, Liberty's Kids, also was in that same bag of having a good sense of how to contribute and how to make accuracy work in a good storytelling and edutainment context. It's really important to get the right consultant when you do that. And so I think I know that I was involved in getting that consultant and setting things up with him. So I guess I had a little bit to do with it. But once the series actually was in production was around the time that I left LA and left my full-time position. And I don't remember sort of being there for the script generation. I do remember rewriting one of the scripts I mentioned to you earlier, and that was one of the last writing gigs that I had, that I did, was I rewrote, I think it was called Bunker Hill, if I'm not mistaken, or the Battle of Bunker Hill or something like that. It was a great series, and we got a lot of amazing celebrities on that series. The Captain Planet experience helped give us credibility with celebrities, and we got a lot of inroads into celebrities and their agents from our experience on Captain Planet. And over the years, intervening years between Captain Planet and Liberty's Kids, we'd use celebrities here and there for specials, and we had a good credibility and a good track record. And Liberty's Kids made a fantastic pitch to get celebrities. And once we got a few of them, then we could name the ones we had and get more. And we ended up with some huge, huge stars on doing voices for Liberty's Kids. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot this. But before I get to that, our talent director and vice president, Marcia Goodman, whom I mentioned earlier, who was just a gem of a human being. I think Liberty's Kids was the most fun series she ever worked on because of all these huge celebrities she got to direct. And I would always, I could have gone to any recording session I wanted to just by saying I want to come, but I never would because I had no role there. But I would always ask Marcia about the recording sessions, and she would tell me great stories. And I'll never forget the one she told me. Apparently, Marcia is known for having a very, shall we say, kind of a dirty mouth. She's the most wonderful person, but her humor is on the colorful side. And that really clicked with some of the celebs. They loved it. And Dustin Hoffman apparently was one of those. And there's a great photo that Marcia has. She worked with Dustin Hoffman on Liberty's Kids. And there's this fantastic photo that Dustin took with her a profile shot. You have to imagine a profile shot with Marcia and Dustin facing each other, face to face, nose to nose. Their noses are touching. And she's so proud of that photo, and it's just wonderful. And she had a lot of great, really fun experiences with these celebrities and a few not so fun ones. But one of my memories, I forgot about this. This was after I had moved to Seattle. There was a big affiliates meeting with all the PBS affiliates to announce and promote Liberty's Kids. And our big get for Liberty's Kids, the big coup that we got Walter Cronkite to do the voice of Benjamin Franklin. And that, of course, was that was part of how we were able to get so many other celebrities. All we had to say is Walter Cronkite's involved, and his reputation was legend by then. Legend. Gosh, one of my real thrills. Andy was unable to do this, I guess, so I was asked to go to this meeting of the PBS affiliates, which was in Baltimore, and Walter Cronkite had agreed to speak at this meeting, and so my job was to go there and introduce Walter Cronkite to this meeting of all the PBS affiliates. So I did. I got to have breakfast with Walter Cronkite, which was an incredible thrill. Then I introduced him as the most trusted man in cartoons. Because I think his moniker had always been the most trusted man in news, or the most trusted name in news. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I looked it up and I had the right wording. So I said, this is the most trusted name in cartoons, and it went over quite well. And he did his presentation. The affiliates were thrilled. Everybody got to shake hands with him or get an autograph if they wanted. But I got some quality time with him, and it was super, super thrill for me to meet Walter Cronkite. Wow, that was terrific.
By the way, you are credited on the episode that you wrote as writer.
Yes, that one. No, that one I did. That one I was able to do under my own name. It was the Sabrina one that I was not able to do under my own name.
So that was the last Deke credit you had. I don't know if you had anything subsequent to that show that you felt needed to be mentioned.
The only other thing that I might mention that never got made, it was kind of a disappointment to me. This was one of my disappointments, along with the James Bond Jr., which did get made but did not get produced by Deke, unfortunately, which was greatly disappointing to me. We developed a show, and again, I give most of the credit to Phil Harnage for the creative concept, but we got together with Bill Nye and developed a show that we called Bill Nye the Science Spy. And it was basically Bill Nye meets James Bond. And it was basically using science in capers, and all these sort of action-adventure capers in which Bill Nye would use science to solve the problem. And it's going to be an animated series. And I thought this was such a terrific idea. And I was such a huge, huge fan of Bill Nye's show. I hadn't even seen his show till we met with him, and I had to bone up by watching a whole bunch of his shows to get myself knowledgeable on it, and I just fell in love with his show. I thought it was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant children's television. And we had a great meeting with him. We came up to Seattle. This was before I lived here. We came up to Seattle and met with him, and he's based in Seattle. And we developed this wonderful, wonderful series, I thought. Really terrific. I mean, I felt it had the Emmy potential, and a great pitch and a great Bible. And we pitched it internationally, and we got great, great response. In fact, I actually pitched it in sort of French. I speak pidgin French, and I was really good friends with the French broadcasters that I pitched it to. We'd done a lot together. And by the way, they spoke perfect English, so I didn't have to pitch it in French. But I used to always try to have fun to speak a little French with these people, and they would always get a kick out of it. So I did the bulk of my pitch in French to them. And I mean, when I needed an English word, I would use it. But they bought it. They committed to it. And I was really excited, and I thought this was going to be our next big Emmy winner. And lo and behold, we couldn't end up making a deal with Bill Nye. It was really, I think, a tragedy. And I think it would have been great for him and great for us. And it's a great regret. So, and I think that I always associate that with after I moved to Seattle, because I think it would have happened after I moved to Seattle. And I would have wanted to be pretty hands-on involved in that series, because I was so fond of it, and I had such respect for Bill.
This may be more of an Andy Hayward question. Do you know why Deke ended up ultimately getting sold to Cookie Jar?
I mean, the reason why is I think Andy wanted to be more financially secure. The business was becoming really challenged. He reached a point in his life and his career where he wanted his payday from this business he had built from scratch, essentially. I mean, I think that was always his goal, was to monetize his investment that he had made and everything he'd put into it. And I think that the time was right. I think he got a good offer.
When did you, this is actually an earlier contribution that we didn't really go in depth in, the Padded Cel articles that you wrote?
Oh, yeah, I had a column.
When did you write that?
I think I started in the 90s, and it went through 2000s. I don't remember the exact years, but it started and ended, but it went through many years. And it was in most months they published it. It started when originally there was another industry publication that was called Kids Screen that still exists. And it's a very important publication in the kids business, both television and marketing, toys, and all sort of everything to do with kids entertainment. And this magazine is called Kids Screen. And I was friendly with the publisher at the time. It was a guy named Ken Fair. And I don't know what possessed me, really. I certainly didn't need any more work or need anything else to do. But for some reason, I'd been doing a lot of press, and I got to know a lot of the press people, and I liked doing press for Deke. And I asked Andy's permission first and got Andy's blessing. And I approached Ken Fair, and I said, how about if I do a column? How would you guys like a column from me? This sort of a comedy column about the kids business, and I'll call it Kiddin' Around, to play on their title of Kids Screen. My column would be called Kiddin' Around. He said, that's a great idea. Let's give it a shot. So he hooked me up with the editor, and I did a few columns like that for Kids Screen. They were called Kiddin' Around. But it wasn't really a good fit. I mean, I wanted to do really funny, sort of irreverent humor. And this was kind of a very business-like magazine. And so, they didn't publish my column often. They didn't request one often. I did the few. And I could tell that there's some issues the things they wanted to change. And as I say, it wasn't in any way an unfriendly or non-amicable situation, but it just wasn't a good creative fit. But at the time, I was also friendly with the executive editor of Animation magazine, which was the other big magazine in our industry. And that was a more kind of fun magazine that was targeted to animators and people that were actually producing animation and a little bit less business-oriented. And I remember having dinner with Rita Street, the editor of Animation, in Cannes one year at one of the markets. And I was good friends with Rita. I just adored her. She's just another one of these incredibly fantastic people who went on to be a producer and still is a producer. Anyway, Rita was telling me how much she loved my columns for Kids Screen and asked me if there was any way I would do a column for Animation magazine. And I said, well, I would have to get Kids Screen's blessing. I wouldn't feel right about it without getting their blessing. They're the ones that published me first. And she said, please ask them. So I did. I went to Kids Screen and I said, I've been approached by Animation magazine. Would you guys be okay with that? And they said, yes. They probably said good riddance. So I went to Rita, went back to Rita, and she said, great, let's do it. And she asked me to submit a list of potential titles for my column. And I did. I gave her about, I think, 15 titles. And she chose Padded Cel. That was one of them, the Padded Cel, which is a play on animation cells, which no longer really are used. But everybody knew what they were. Even back then, everybody knew what animation cells were. It's spelled CEL, short for cellulite or cellulose or something, which is the material that they're made from. And anyway, the column was launched. And the editor that I worked with was a guy named Ramin Zaid. Boy, had I found my soulmate, my creative soulmate. It was a total meeting of the minds and love fest between Ramin and I from the beginning. He shared exactly my sense of humor. He was like a pop culture maven, much like you are, Joshua. He knew every reference I could come up with. He knew it and more. And I started turning in the columns, and he would never give me a note, ever. He'd just say, this is great. I love it. This is so funny. Publish it. And they found a woman named Mercedes. I wish I could remember her last name, but a woman named Mercedes who worked for Animation Magazine, who would do a great illustration for my column every month, a really funny sort of cartoon that went with the subject of the column. And Ramin would always write these little about the author things at the end, that says, Robby London is an animation industry executive, blah, blah, blah. Just a little, blurb that was at the end of every column. And typically, the column writer himself writes those things, or in a book, the author writes them. But in this case, Ramin would write them, and they would always be funny, some really funny, dumb thing about me that I'd never know what they were. I'd look forward, I wouldn't see it. Every month I wouldn't see it till the column was published, and I'd open the magazine and see a little funny blurb Ramin had written about me, and I always got a chuckle out of it. And this went on for many, many years, most months. I mean, every now and then he would call me and say, we don't have room this month or something. But I would say probably 9 to 10 months a year he would ask for a column. 90% of the time I could write whatever I wanted. Every now and then he would request a topic that would fit with what the magazine was doing that month, like the theme of the magazine. But mostly it was just my choice. I could write whatever I wanted. Whatever I wrote, he published. And the really, really great thing about this for me was it's the first time I'd ever been able to write in my own voice, because I wasn't writing for kids. And in fact, I was writing for a lot of animators and artists who have a very, very irreverent kind of humor, as you can imagine, a kind of a dark, edgy humor. And that's the kind of humor I love and I like. And, I had to keep it in check for my entire career, because when you're writing for children's television or producing it, you can't do that stuff. You just can't. And, I think it's one reason I never really, I got great satisfaction from the writing I did, but there was something about writing that column that I just felt like finally I can write as myself, and I don't have to censor myself, and I can put what I think is funny. And it seemed like everything I thought was funny was what Ramin thought was funny, so we published it. And I had a headshot in the column, and people used to come up to me at the markets and at public functions that I didn't even know, that recognized me from the headshot. And this is people not even necessarily in the kids business, because these markets were for all of television. They weren't just kids biz markets. And people would come up to me from my column. They'd say, I love your column, or your column really made me laugh. I was like some of my favorite praise that I ever got, even though it was a very, very small part of my career, and it was really just moonlighting. But it gave me a disproportionate degree of satisfaction and joy to do that column for all the years that I did it. It was just a real pleasure. Well, I'm going to tell you a story that's, neither here nor there, but it's just, for me, it was a really, really fun story.
If you're comfortable with people hearing it.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine with it. So I have a really good friend in the industry, had and still have, one of my best friends to this day. And we were very competitive with each other in terms of our profile and our publicity and stuff, and all in good fun, of course. We'd tease each other about who got better coverage on this, and we would be on panels together a lot, and we would say who got the better applause. And, it was just that kind of a fun, buddy, competitive kind of relationship. And I would travel with him. And by the way, he really resented, in a comical way, he resented my column because, I'm getting coverage every month with my picture. And people would come up to me when I'd be with him, and it just in a fun way, it irked him that I had my column. It was a point of irritation for him. Anyway, go to the market, and we would sometimes market in Cannes, and we'd be in Europe, and we'd sometimes just go for a trip somewhere for a few days together afterwards, just for fun. And one trip in particular, we went to the west coast of Ireland, to Galway, and we decided one day to take a trip out to a place called the Aran Islands, which is arguably the most remote outpost in Europe. It's the furthest west point in Europe, I'm told. To get there, you have to take, I think, like an hour bus ride from Galway, and then a 30 or 40-minute ferry, and you're out in the middle of the Atlantic there, and you come across these tiny, tiny islands. And there's one main island. And I think, maybe 200 people live there or something. There's a dock, and there's a restaurant and a little store for tourists, and that's sort of it. And you land there, and there's a few like minivans waiting to take the tourists from the ferry. The only people that go there really are tourists. And there's minivans that you get on, and they take the tourists around the island and show you things. And so my friend and I get on one of these minivans, and one of the stops is he points up to this huge cliff up in the distance. Says, you guys have to go walk up there. It's an easy trail, and it's just a spectacular, spectacular view up there. Got to go. So we say, great, and we go. And my friend walks much faster than I do, and he got to the top of these cliffs about 5 or 10 minutes ahead of me, and there were a few other people up there. So I'm up there looking at the view, and one of the other people up there starts staring at me and staring at me some more and looking at me quizzically, and I'm thinking, why is this guy looking at me? And he says to me, are you that guy from Animation Magazine, that Colin from Animation Magazine? And so I turned to my friend and I said, ha, 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 very funny. And I turned to the guy that said this. I said, yeah, that's funny. Good acting, great performance. Because obviously my friend had put him up to it. But the joke was, the punchline was, my friend had not put him up to it. He actually recognized me from the column on the Aran Islands, on the top of a cliff in one of the remote spots, arguably in all of Europe. And it turned out he was an animator. He worked in an animation studio in Ireland, and they were just sightseeing all day. And he recognized me from my column. It was like I might as well have been Tom Cruise that day. And my friend has never gotten over it to this day. And I've never let him forget it. Pretty funny. Pretty funny.
After you left Deke, what did you do? Are you at liberty to say, or do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I used the word reprioritize, which is kind of my wimpy way of saying retired. I didn't really like the phrase or the concept of retired. But the reality is my passion is music. It's always been music. I originally had wanted to have a career in music, and the only reason I didn't, well, there's two reasons I didn't. One is I don't think I have enough talent to have succeeded. And two was trying to succeed in music was so stressful and so miserable that it was making me hate the one thing that I purely loved, in my heart and soul. The thing that gave me the most pleasure was becoming a source of stress and misery. So I kind of made a conscious decision in my 20s to stop trying to monetize music and find another way to make a living. But I always, throughout my life and throughout all my years at Deke, to the degree that time allowed, which wasn't enough, I've always had kind of a home studio and always played instruments and always written songs and always tried to pursue that. So one of the reasons I wanted to leave in 2000, one of my goals was just to have a lot more time to work on music and do musical things. So when I moved to Seattle, one of the things I did was I took some courses in arranging at a local community college, which were just fantastic. The best courses I've ever taken in anything. They were just, the teacher was perfect for me, right at the exact level I was, because I'd already studied some music theory, and this just took me to a different level. And I started to meet a lot of people involved in music up here, and interestingly enough, I became really good friends with one of the main songwriter from Heart, apart from Ann and Nancy Wilson. They wrote two, but this was their best friend who wrote a lot of the Heart songs with them. And I even got to meet Heart, and I got to jam with them a couple of times and play music with Heart, which was a real thrill for me because they're Rock and Roll Hall of Famers now. And I remember one New Year's Eve, I got to play music with just Ann, Nancy, and one other person, just four of us, for about 3 hours on New Year's Eve playing acoustic guitars. And it was just a real thrill for me. And I play in a couple bands, and so I do music now. That's what I've been doing really since I moved here in 2000, and even more since 2008 when Deke was sold to Cookie Jar, and I no longer had any responsibilities in the animation industry. I had, a couple of little small consulting things the first year or two, but nothing that really stuck and nothing that it really worked out in a great way. But I've really spent whatever time that I want to be productive, I spend doing music to this day. That's my thing.
What do you think is your biggest contribution to the world of animation?
Here's what I think. I don't think so much in terms of shows. I mean, I think there are shows that I worked on that have great resonance. He-Man seems to be the one that resonates the most. And I guess I could mention that I've been invited for years and years and years to go to PowerCon, which is the He-Man con. And I've declined until 2 years ago. I finally agreed to go for my first and only time. And I was absolutely flabbergasted by the people that came up to me and the people I met, who are now in their 30s and 40s, who shared with me the impact that He-Man had upon their lives and especially people that had horrible problems when they were kids and hospitalized and abusive parents and all sorts of really tragic stories that they basically said, our show helped them manage and get through. And I mean, it's really hard to describe. And people were in tears, literally, to meet me. And it was such a powerful and moving experience I'd never, ever experienced prior to this. Kind of the impact of shows that I had worked on people's psyche and on their lives. I mean, because one of the huge drawbacks of working in TV is you never really see an audience react to your show. You work in isolation, and in animation there's usually almost a year lag between the time you write something and the time it's on the air, and you're not with anybody when it's on the air anyway. So you really don't know how people are taking what you do. So I suppose He-Man apparently has had a profound effect on a lot of people. And I have to say, He-Man, of all the things I worked on, is the thing that I feel most responsible for in a hands-on way. I mean, I feel that I had the most to contribute in terms of what He-Man was when it went on the air. That was, more me, I think, than almost anything else that I worked on. But in terms of my contribution, that's not really how I think. I don't think so much of the shows. I think of the people that I worked with and all the people that I helped give jobs to and maybe mentored and that went on to great things. I mean, I was really proud of. I felt good about the way I tried to treat people that I had influence over and that were reliant upon me for, in some cases, their livelihood and whatever. And went on to great things. I mean, Deke was just an incredible training ground. Daily Variety did a big anniversary show on Deke one year, and it was just full of stories about Deke. And I remember one of the stories was they went around to a lot of the people whose careers had started at Deke and had gone on to, great things, and interviewed them all. And, they all mentioned talked about how Deke was such a great experience and how people were really given a chance to sink or swim at Deke. I mean, we took chances on people and gave people a lot of responsibility early on and gave a lot of people their first credits. And several people mentioned me by name in that article. And I think that's the kind of thing I feel more proud of and feel in a way that I was more influential directly on people's lives than the show. I'm sure the shows were too, but I just don't experience it. Other than that one He-Man con. And, I'll meet people from time to time that ask me what I did, and I tell them, and they go, "Oh, wow, you worked on that. I love that show," which is great. I love to hear that. But that's just one person here and one person there. You don't really get a visceral sense of having having been a big influence. I suspect that there is it. It's just that I haven't experienced it, so I don't really think about it in those terms.
You influenced me, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate hearing that. It means really a lot to me. So thank you for sharing that. And it always means a lot to me when people say it. But it's hard to, as I say, I think visceral is the key word. It's hard to get a visceral sense of it. The only time I ever really, really sensed it was at PowerCon that year. That was really a profound experience for me.
And on that same note, thank you for ruining my life and giving me the position that I am now.
I say that a lot. I joke that I started off my life on a clinical psychology track where I wanted to be a psychologist. And I joke that at one point I realized that in an entire career of being a psychotherapist, the best I could hope for would be to screw up maybe 500 or 1,000 people. Whereas as a TV writer, a children's television writer, I could screw up millions of kids every single week. So it was sort of, if you want to screw people up, it's an economy of scale to be a TV writer rather than a psychologist. That's my joke.
I like to think of it as a scared straight scenario.
That's funny. That's very funny. We were involved with we got involved at Filmation. I don't remember what, and you're going to ask me, maybe it was a Fat Albert. I think it was a Fat Albert. But we got involved with the Scared Straight producer. I've forgotten his name. But we met with him.
The guy who made the movie Scared Straight in the 70s?
Well, the guy that started, it was like a whole program, a whole thing, a concept. And I don't know if it was, I think it was a movie. It was a documentary, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a documentary in 78 that was made by
I think
Arnold Shapiro.
That's the guy. Yeah, we met with him, and we dealt with him. And I think maybe it was for a Fat Albert episode. I don't remember the context, or maybe we were talking about a series or something. But I definitely remember meeting him. Yeah. Yep.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to work in the world of television animation?
Be prepared for a long, hard slog. Be absolutely committed to it. Get a job, any job, in any studio or entity that's producing it. Don't take yourself too seriously. Understand that until you develop a track record, people will not likely be interested in your creative input or think you're a genius, even if you are one. You know, you have to sort of prove yourself, and you have to listen to people. And at almost every level, no matter who you are and how successful you get, there's virtually always someone above you that's going to be able to reverse you and tell you what they think, and their vision will prevail over yours. And that's a really hard concept to accept, I think, when you're young and you've got ideas and you think your ideas are great. And they may be great. I mean, great is all relative anyway. I would read this book, even though it's really, really dated now, and it's nothing to do with animation, but it's a really good sort of primer about working in showbiz. And the name of the book is Adventures in the Screen Trade, written by William Goldman, who is a famous, famous screenwriter who wrote many classic films. And this book is really, really a readable book. It's so much fun to read. Guy is a great, great storyteller. And basically it's just a book about anecdotes about his life. In his case, it was the movie business, but a lot of it applies to all of the entertainment business. And it's just so much of it is an attitude. And another piece of advice is it's not what you do, it's how you are perceived. This is true, I think, in all businesses, but it's particularly true in entertainment business. It's a business of perception. So the fact that you do something great is not enough. You got to make sure that people know you're doing it, but you got to do it in a way that's subtle and clever. And you can't consciously and directly call attention to yourself. But if you're doing good stuff, you better find a way to make sure people are knowing that you're doing good stuff. Otherwise, it's like the tree falling in the forest and you'll never get anywhere. There's a really fine balance between being pushy and aggressive, which is important up to a point, but it's a very fine line when you go over that point and you become obnoxious and a pest. And that's I think one of the hardest things about getting started in the industry and advancing in the industry is sufficiently pushy and forward without crossing the line and being obnoxious or being a pest. And it's really hard to know sometimes. I think that's one of the hardest roads to navigate, is how much to push and how much to push yourself out there when it's too far. Be a nice person. Be likable. Find a mentor. It's so important. And keep looking until you find the right one.
Thank you, Robby London, for telling your story.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for listening. To anybody that's stuck with all of this, thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. 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 Hope you